Paul Simon made a secret promise to himself before Art Garfunkel walked away. Paul Simon was born Paul Frederick Simon on October 13, 1941 in Newark, New Jersey. While the world would one day know him as the poet laureate of pop anxiety, his story began in a Jewish household in Queens, where music was not just entertainment but a ticket out of the ordinary. Raised by his parents Louis and Belle Simon, Paul was a short, scrappy kid who heard rhythm in the subway screech and melody in the hum of the city. From the bustling streets of Forest Hills to the folk clubs of Greenwich Village, Paul and his reluctant partner Art Garfunkel shared a vocal blend that was divine on tape but fractured in real life. The release of The Sound of Silence in 1965 was a twist of fate. A producer overdubbed electric instruments without telling them, and suddenly two quiet Jewish kids from Queens were the voice of a generation. Paul was the engine, a relentless perfectionist who wrote songs like he was solving a mathematical equation. But the road to glory was paved with silent resentment. In an era when rock music was becoming louder and more rebellious, Paul Simon was writing quiet, introspective masterpieces. And while the world saw harmony behind the scenes, the partnership was disintegrating. Paul felt trapped by Art's slower pace. Art felt bullied by Paul's sharp tongue. They stopped speaking to each other on stage, even while sharing a microphone. In 1970, they released Bridge Over Troubled Water, an album that should have been a celebration. Instead, it was a eulogy. Paul wrote nearly every song. Art sang them like an angel. And then, without a goodbye tour, they dissolved. Paul moved to England, wounded and free, wondering if he could exist without the ghost of the duo that had made him famous. And it was in England, in 1971, that Paul Simon met the man who would change his soul, George Harrison. But even as Paul tasted solo success, a darker feeling began to creep in. He had escaped Art, but he hadn't escaped himself. Many fans don't know that during his first solo tour, Paul had panic attacks so severe he couldn't finish songs. Eventually, Paul found a new direction, blending world music into his 1986 album, Graceland. But the friendship with George Harrison deepened during those difficult years. The mid-1970s had marked a shift in Paul's sound, but George was going through his own transformation, leaving the Beatles behind to garden and write songs about the divine. One of the most profound, yet often overlooked chapters of Paul's life was his quiet, unspoken rivalry and love for George Harrison. In 1975, George invited Paul to his home in Henley-on-Thames. They sat in the garden with acoustic guitars. George had just released Extra Texture. Paul was working on Still Crazy after all these years. George looked at Paul and said something that Paul has only now, at 82, revealed. "You write like you're running out of time. I write like I have forever. That's why your songs are brilliant. And that's why you're never happy." The truth hit Paul like a falling piano. He realized he had never written a single song without anxiety. They began to collaborate loosely, with George contributing guitar to Paul's demos. But the sessions were strange. George would stop playing mid-song to watch a bird. Paul would pace, tapping his watch. Paul later spoke of the truth he learned from George, that the most powerful music comes not from ambition, but from surrender. The two shared a bond rooted in mutual respect, but also a fundamental misunderstanding. Paul once asked George, "Don't you want to be number one?" George laughed and said, "I was number one. It was lonely. Now I want to be at peace." Paul admits now that he didn't understand that answer for 20 years. Their collaboration was cut short, not by death, but by silence. They drifted apart in the 1980s. Paul was chasing Graceland. George was chasing the horizon. And then, in 2001, George was dying of cancer. Did you know the secret promise Paul Simon made to himself before George was gone? Paul Simon was born Paul Frederick Simon on October 13, 1941 in Newark, New Jersey. While the world would one day know him as the anxious genius behind Mrs. Robinson, his story began in a small apartment where his father played bass in nightclubs. Raised by his parents Louis and Belle, Paul was the only child of a loving but struggling household. From the libraries of Queens to the stages of Monterey, Paul carried a notebook and a grudge. The Simon and Garfunkel breakup in 1970 was brutal, but it was George Harrison who taught Paul that some endings are just beginnings in disguise. In 1988, when Paul's marriage was falling apart, he called George, not for advice on chords, for advice on breathing. George told him, "You can't hold a note if you're holding your heart so tight." While Paul Simon was conquering the world with Graceland, a quieter, more fragile story was unfolding with George Harrison, who had been stabbed in his own home by an intruder in 1999. Paul flew to see him in the hospital. George was pale, but he was smiling. He said, "Paul, you still look worried. Let it go." Paul didn't let it go. That was the problem. In 2001, when George finally passed from lung cancer, Paul was on tour. He stopped the show. He didn't sing a song. He just stood there in silence for 2 minutes. The audience wept. Paul later admitted that was the only time in his life he had nothing to say. This was the first time Paul felt the agonizing truth of outliving a friend who had been a mirror. He later admitted that he spent years wondering why George's peace had eluded him. The guilt of being the survivor, the still anxious one, colored his album Surprise in 2006 with a darker, more reflective tone. In 2016, Paul Simon released Stranger to Stranger, an album filled with the echo of mortality. He had outlived George by 15 years. He had watched Art Garfunkel age. Behind the scenes of his final tour, Homeward Bound, Paul made the agonizing decision to retire from touring. He felt that the road, which had been his fuel, was now just a reminder of running away. For the first time in his life, Paul Simon sat still. He built a garden. He planted trees. He finally understood what George had tried to tell him in 1975. The final piece clicked in 2023 when Paul's hearing began to fail. He couldn't hear the perfection anymore. And for the first time, he wasn't scared. Did you know the secret promise Paul Simon finally made before he lost his own voice? Paul Simon was born Paul Frederick Simon on October 13th, 1941. While the world knows him as the lion of lyrical density, his true lesson came from the quiet Beatle. Raised by his parents in Queens, Paul learned that music was a weapon against silence. From the echo chambers of Columbia Records to the angry feedback of the Disco Sucks movement that Paul openly mocked, he never stopped working. But George Harrison worked differently. George worked to stop. In the early 2000s, when Paul was asked to write a tribute for George, he wrote a song called So Beautiful or So What? The song asked the question, what is the meaning of this life? Paul admits now that the answer came from a dream about George. In the dream, George was tuning a guitar. He didn't look up. He just said, "You're still counting the bars, Paul. Stop counting. Just play." Paul woke up crying. He realized he had spent 70 years counting. Counting hits. Counting tempos. Counting the empty spaces where art used to sing. And George, in death, had given him the only truth that mattered. The truth was that there is no truth. Only the note you're playing right now. At 82, Paul Simon has finally told the truth about George Harrison. George was not just a Beatle. He was a gardener who happened to play guitar. He was a man who watched birds while Paul watched the clock. And Paul Simon, the great architect of American music, the man who could turn a nervous breakdown into a hit single, learned that his greatest song was never written. It was the silence he shared with George on a lawn in Henley in 1975. Two geniuses, two very different paths. One went home, one kept walking, but neither was lost. And now, as Paul Simon's own hearing fades and his voice grows softer, he doesn't fight the quiet anymore. He listens for George's tuning peg. Somewhere in the garden, there is a chord, 1025, and for the first time in his life, Paul Simon is not rushing to write it down. He's just letting it ring.